Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, everyone, and thanks a lot for joining this session. I'm here to speak a little bit about some ideas that our research project has on open science and this idea of automated private interactions. So how do we place chatbots as data collection engines within an open science and an open data perspective? And this presentation is a result of ongoing collaboration with Brahim Zarouali, Jacob Omme, and Claes de Vreese at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research. So if we think a little bit more in terms of a background, we see an increasing relevance of chatbots and potentially conversational agents more broadly in our communication environment, and some very interesting discussions as well in terms of research agendas for communication research when we think about human-machine communication or human AI interactions more broadly. Now, when thinking about it, one of the things that we wanted to reconcile is this with an open science or an open data paradigm. And when thinking of this, we thought about primarily two dimensions in which we can have research regarding this topic. So the most common one is thinking about chatbots as objects of study. So when we're doing research about chatbots, when we're interested in the user perceptions, individual differences, antecedents or consequences, or even the content of communication with this type of conversational agents. But one of the things that we also think about, and that's where our project is mostly interested on, and where a lot of the discussions about open science and open data were generated, was using chatbots as methods of study. So thinking, for example, using the convenience of participants already having access to messaging apps and having using social media platforms and embedding chatbots there to do research from a perspective of maybe substituting surveys or longitudinal designs, but also in any sense having studies with or about chatbots within the platforms in which users or individuals would normally have interactions with, to as a way to gain ecological validity. So when we think about it, what we want to reconcile is the idea of ecological validity, as I was mentioning before, but also with the notion of guaranteeing participant privacy or understanding the threats towards privacy, and how to do it more broadly in an open science and also open data perspective. Now, to think about it, if we think about the ecosystem itself, so this is what a user might see or an individual might see in Facebook Messenger, for example. So this is a real chatbot from ABC News. You can already see that it knows a couple of things about me, for example, my name, but also maybe my propensity not to read a lot of messages all the time. But if we consider this as a front end, when we think about the back end, or actually what is needed to enable this type of automated interactions, it becomes a lot more complex, a lot more quickly. So this is just one example or one illustration. This is coming from Microsoft, but I mean, there are several other options and platforms and frameworks available, but there's a lot of services and a lot of things from platforms that are actually used in order to make this experience in the front end available to a user. So if we, more specifically for our case, if we think about it a little bit more specifically, so you have the messaging platform, which is where individuals will be having a conversation with a chatbot, either a chatbot from an existing service maybe that we're just interested in terms of how people would perceive when we're talking, I don't know, with KLM or with a news organization or something else, but also in the messaging platform being used by our own experiments in which we're publishing a chatbot there, or that we're using a chatbot as a way to substitute maybe a survey or to have a different type of data collection being done with a user. So there is the front end. But then there is also a web service in a sense that the chatbot needs to be available somewhere, and it actually needs to be interacting with the messaging platform in some way. And here I'm listing again some of the most common platforms that are used to do so. There's a dialogue management aspect. So there are services available that would handle the dialogue, because again, a participant is not simply talking something to the chatbot, but there's a whole dialogue. There are questions that the chatbot will make, and there are answers from the participants, and there are questions or answers from the chatbot that are contingent to what the participant has said. And these are some of the most common frameworks that are available. And you will notice that all of them are actually from one of the big platforms. Microsoft Bot Framework, Dialogflow being from Google, Weeds.ai being from Facebook, IBM Watson, and there are several others as well, to one shape or form, are also tied to platforms in a way or might require some thought. And then finally, as researchers, we want to actually study these interactions. So logging these conversations is very important, which also implies that there is a database behind. Now, when we think about it, this immediately brings some considerations about the impact to privacy and to our ability to do this in an open way. So the first set of these considerations being about how the chatbot is being set up. So what services or platforms we're using, like thinking about the previous slide. Do we have a database storing logs, and what type of user information are we storing? Then where does the research take place? So are we using messaging apps from platforms, and which messaging apps are we using? And also, if we're doing a one-shot or a longitudinal design, because with a one-shot design, we might even be able to stay away from some type of user identifying information, but longitudinal designs usually require us to know who the user is. And in that sense, anonymity might actually be compromised here, which is not necessarily a problem, but definitely a consideration. And finally, what type of data are collected? Because digital trace data are collected by default simply to have a chatbot up and running. And we might be collecting even more types of information depending on the design, which also implies that user identifying information might be needed, especially, for example, for longitudinal designs. So these considerations, they lead to some challenges, to some trade-offs. So first of all, participant anonymity is often lacking by default. So this is not a normal survey that we would do, and we might anonymize IPs or not ask for certain things, and therefore not necessarily have to handle some type of user data. In this case, because it is a chatbot, there are certain things that the service needs to know in order to function, especially in longitudinal designs, but more in general. And the anonymity that we might be used to in other types of design, or at least assume that we have, is here really lacking by default. A second thing and a second set of considerations, and it's really a challenge in that sense, is that by asking things in with a chatbot in a platform, in a messaging platform, we're generating personal data also in and for that platform. And if you see the terms of service, for example, from Facebook and other platforms, it's not necessarily all the time clear that they will or will not use that type of the answers that participants might be giving to generate their own profiles, because these are conversations happening in Messenger or WhatsApp and so forth. So by asking, for example, for somebody's political preferences, you might actually be also giving that information to Facebook itself, indirectly, of course. And then finally, the more conversations, the lower the anonymity. So even if you're extremely careful, the more that somebody is chatting with a chatbot, the better the profile that is being created for yourself and potentially for a platform there. Now, we are considering all of these things, and some of the thoughts that we are having at this point in terms of how can we reconcile doing this in a strict way, also considering that we want to, as much as possible, go by the open science approach, and even more in terms of open data, so ultimately having our data available to others. The first thing that we are considering is that actually pre-registration is our friend here. So we strongly believe in pre-registration in general, but in this case, it's even more important because one of the things that the general data protection regulation, so from the European Union, stipulates is that you need to minimize the data collection, and you are only collecting the data that you need. So by going through the pre-registration approach, we are also having to think quite a lot in terms of what are the things that we actually want to collect. A second thing that we are doing is we're adapting our own framework that our research institute has developed, our lab has developed, so the Conversational Agent Research Toolkit, to serve as an intermediary between platforms and anonymize or minimize the data flow across the platforms when possible. So it's pretty much having it as an intermediary here. So it's taking care of the database and also encrypting and anonymizing things in the database where possible, but also minimizing, for example, information that might be going from Facebook to the dialogue management tool or the other way around. So we're trying to, as much as possible, hide information from the platforms as we can, or anonymize them as we can. Of course, being fully aware that in some cases that might not be possible, right? The history of the conversations will be available in a messaging platform. But these are also some trade-offs that we need to have in terms of doing research in the platforms or having ecological validity going on. And a final thing that we're also considering pretty strongly is having the chatbot code and the configurations as open source. As we have our existing framework, it's open source and is available for reuse. But also we're having in-depth discussions about the extent to which we can make the actual conversational logs as open data available to the community versus the anonymity of the participants. And these are discussions that are still ongoing and that we're not fully through yet, because this really requires a lot of thought about, even if we remove user IDs, even if we remove names and other things, the more, the richer this corpus is, potentially the easier it is to actually make some inferences about who the users are. So these are discussions that we're still having. So in summary, we feel that the research with and about chatbots is an extremely rich and important field that will be increasingly relevant in the future, but that we need to have very early on a very good set of discussions about how to do it in an open way that at the same time is very respectful or aware of the trade-offs with regards to participant privacy, anonymity, and open science more in general. So this is a bit where we are right now in terms of our thought process. And I would be extremely curious in terms of understanding of what are your questions, comments. Maybe you're thinking about additional challenges or potentially already some solutions that you might want to share with us. So I look forward to your comments. Thank you very much for your attention.